And so I was just like mind blown that he literally said, I did it. And then after that, he said that he looked himself in the mirror and he said, quote unquote, when you do something wrong, you know that you're not proud of yourself. Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Hey, Rachel. Good to see you.
Hey, Jeremy. Nice to see you as well.
Yeah, we came together because there was an interesting article that we both got us discussing. And it's about Jabran, who is the eFishery founder. And he made a confession and explained how he faked the results in this $300 million meltdown for his eFishery unicorn. And this was published on Bloomberg. And so I was like, who else would be a good lawyer to discuss this with?
First, I'm just surprised that he's making such a public confession when I think the investigations are probably ongoing. And it's probably he either wants it or he thinks it's a good tactic to get sympathy votes. But I have no idea who's advising him. Other than that, it's just pure stupidity.
Why is it pure stupidity from your perspective?
We often hear these statements being made by people who are under investigation. Our lawyer has advised us not to say anything to the media, pending investigations. Perspective, I would expect that he's exposed to both criminal and civil investigations. People are doing the right things. Criminal, because if he has faked the books, then I would imagine that he has definitely, at the very least, be held accountable for fraud. And civil, because he would have been a party to a shareholders agreement with lots of contractor obligations, including, for example, undertaking that he runs the company to the best of his abilities, making the correct representations and warranties when the investors were doing due diligence. And I want him to be able to come up story to the media before these investigations are closed, because we are very careful about what is being, like, we call it the discovery process, whereby people give evidence to the other side to say, okay, what's going on? Was it a time? What were you saying? How are you defending yourself? So it's rather brave of him to come up with to Bloomberg. Maybe he was offered a huge amount of money for this article. I would imagine the cost getting himself out of trouble will be more than whatever Bloomberg.
Go into that, right? Because he literally, in this article, says that he plugged in the fake numbers into his financial report
Exactly.
that was given.
Yes.
He literally said this, like mind blown when I read it, because like you said, SBF at FTX very much was like, I wasn't aware.
Yeah.
And there is actually a history of him to be like very hands off with financial management and everything.
Yes.
Those lawyers are busy, but like I directly did A, B, and C. And so I was just like mind blown that he literally said, I did it. And then after that, he said that he looked himself in the mirror and he said, quote unquote, when you do something wrong, you know that you're not proud of yourself. And so I thought it was just so weird that legally he chose to confess and say that he did it. So this is the discovery phase of any investigation.
Yes. To be honest, when I first heard about this news, I had some doubts, because as a CEO, you can't be expected to look into every single line item. Sometimes there are times when it's purely just negligence, but gross negligence is just a much higher threshold. Sometimes it's just pure, you're running a company, it's growing so fast, you cannot help it. But when you do admit very publicly that you have cheated, and in a very black and white fashion, the only person I can think about suing right now, if you want to get yourself out of this trouble, is the reporters to say that they misquoted you or something. Short of that, I think you have got yourself into some hot soup. But there could be some reasons why he's saying it. Maybe he just wants to share his story, but it could be naive for him to think that the most negative consequence has already come. It could also be a case of enforceability, because a lot of the companies that invest in him are international investors. They are based outside of Indonesia. He's probably still in Indonesia at this point in time. So he might be thinking as well, maybe it's a case of, hey, I can talk about this story, gain more media attention, maybe even have a following from that. I don't think the law enforcement agencies are able to go past the jurisdiction of enforcement. For example, they're holding companies in Singapore and a judgment is released in Singapore. The people who want to enforce the monetary or criminal sort of like penalties would have to try to seek a cross-border enforcement process, which is not so easy. So some of the things that he went through his mind when he felt so comfortable sharing his story.
Yeah, I
Tricky
think,
part,
go ahead.
the tricky part with investing in Indonesian companies in Indonesia, I myself think that you do need to have a Bahasa translation of the version will always override the English version. There's a potential that if you want to have an agreement with an Indonesian party, it has to be governed by Indonesian law. Knowing the legal uncertainties, but then recognizing the economic potential that a country like Indonesia with huge population and young population has, a lot of investors have come into the market. But when it comes to enforcement comes into play when we say, hey, you did something wrong, we're going to either freeze your bank accounts or put you in jail or send you to this long criminal trial or civil trial. It may get a bit more difficult if these companies don't have, let's say, a country like Singapore or in the countries where they're based.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the things that he mentioned that he felt were contributing factors. The first thing that he said was that he felt that in Indonesia, everybody else was also doing it. He said that, quote unquote, he had done a deal that had bought him time, but still no other VC else agreed to join. And so he was dejected and asked fellow Indonesian founders how they'd managed to raise new funds. The tips were vague and coded, but the answer Gibran took it was essentially to fudge the numbers. They told me that they massage the numbers and that they have some supposed growth hacking initiatives that they do, and usually they do it prior to the fundraising. He knew it was wrong, but he felt that everyone else is doing it and they're still doing okay and never got caught. You question if it's really wrong.
Yeah, I love the fact that they use the word massage. I actually love massages, but not when it's used in this context.
You gotta make me.
It's just saying as I could say marriage, for example, or everyone is cheating on their spouses, therefore I'm allowed to cheat on your spouse. I think it's that these are the parameters I play with. This is where I hope to be versus massaging their numbers to say that this is something that they're actually experiencing. But coming from someone who has been in VC for a while and founded a startup yourself.
So I think there are two parts that he's saying, right? The first part is his defense, right? Which is saying everyone else is doing it, therefore I do it. And I always remember like my mom, scolding me, right? It's like, hey, if everybody else is jumping off a cliff, do you also jump off a cliff? And then I'll be like, no. It's a bit of a rhetorical question, right? That you get asked, right? I think that's like a clear like attempt at a moral defense, which is like moral equivalence. So I think that's one side. And then I think the second part that you go one level deeper is like, is it true? Is it true that fraud is more prevalent in Indonesia and a lot of them don't get caught? In other words, it is a commonly accepted behavior. And I think the part that has like a nugget of truth to it in the sense that as a VC, I have seen founders with frankly bad books. So I've seen that. And I would say that level of accounting mismanagement, and I look at it from a good faith perspective, from an external perspective, does seem to be more prevalent in Indonesia compared to Singaporean startups. But like you said, it's a function of multiple reasons. I think one level is startups in Indonesia tend to be younger. Two, there aren't a lot of good CFOs or accountants who are startup lending. And then a lot of these businesses are quite complex because they're handling like physical, farmers, distributed, physical assets. So to some extent, there's a lot of moving pieces, and obviously the digital infrastructure in Indonesia, and they tend to be technology-enabled businesses, right? So it's like accounting times construction, startup growth rate. So to some extent, from the outside in, you're just like, okay, this doesn't match. But I think there's a part is that he's basically saying, and his claim is that there's a lot more fraud in Indonesia startup ecosystem.
Do you think that's true? Do you see startups in Silicon Valley also like boosting their numbers quite a fair bit? Or that's just something that you think is localized to?
I think what's true is that for you to raise venture capital, you need startup growth rates. And that means like doubling or tripling every year. So I think that incentive ecosystem, because that's just the VC funding milestone that people have, right?
Yeah.
And if it's longer, then it takes longer for you to grow into the valuation. But really, I think that growth rate is what is the range that VCs are. And we have seen fraud in America. We saw that with Theranos, where they made R&D claims and product claims and were not able to get there. I think we've seen fraud also happen in the US ecosystem as well. We've also seen that in the Southeast Asia, and Singapore itself has its own fair share as well. So I think there's a bit of a tricky component where, yeah, I think fraud can happen in any ecosystem. If you like invert that question and say, is there fraud in startup in every ecosystem? Even Wirecard, which is a
Yes.
German billion-dollar darling payments, was brought down by a Singaporean lawyer whistleblower called Pav Gill. So to some extent, I think there's the crux of it. I understand the moral equivalence argument, so be it. Then is there fraud in the startup ecosystem? Yes, because of the incentive structure. And a lot of these startup founders tend to be young, foolish, willing to cut the rules, times lacks governance controls or financial controls and accounting advice. Then the last layer is he's saying that it's prevalent in the Indonesian ecosystem.
Yeah. So I think it's just maybe a little bit unfair for him to say that this is prevailing in the Indonesian ecosystem. With suite of example, where this is really going to become a terminology here. It happens not just in developing countries, but also in other places as well. And I think it's just doing a bit of discredit to the culture because foreign investors with not much knowledge of what happens on the ground altogether because these numbers are not verifiable. But in essence, the problem that needs to be solved is, as you mentioned, clearer accounting standards that fits the country. It could be difficult to get local fishermen to key in numbers accurately. So how do we solve that? How do we increase confidence in investors when they see the numbers that you're seeing? Is there like a certificate that needs to be applied on top of? So the common rule is you don't need audited accounts to reach a certain threshold. So that's it to be tightened, and do we need additional certificates that sits with the culture, or it is a trend for all my peers and others. Also see a lot of good startup founders who work really hard to try to achieve the milestones, or sometimes simply just don't push back to investors and say this is not something we can achieve at this point in time. I do understand that with VC investments, there is a expectation for very high growth rates. And I think then we just have to be fair because not willing to invest unless they see the growth rates and they expect the startup founders to be selling that story, then these investors should also be coming in with their eyes open. So it's a two-way system where if you want to expect these things and you want to hear this story, you have to be able to understand that not all these stories are going to be true because the reality that adults should understand is that it's just harder to achieve this. You need to see is a clear roadmap to try and achieve those numbers. And then with all types of investments, we're playing with the risks. Have the act to take the risk if some of the assumptions that we apply are wrong. And I think it's a little bit unfair to now put all the blame on the founder without having the same blame on investors for having maybe sometimes. But I'm not sure. We're still figuring ourselves out.
Yeah. I love what you said about how it's unfair to all Indonesian founders. I think what I would say is that in every ecosystem, there's always bad apples, right? There are Singaporean court cases going on today for Singaporean startup founders or large technology founders that are committing fraud. There's a Singaporean guy in America who stole like, I don't know, a lot of crypto. Yeah, exactly, right? So I think there's a lot of bad apples in any ecosystem. And I think what I would say, to be fair, is that I think in Indonesia, there's a sense that my Indonesian friends say is if you're a bad apple, there are less consequences, right?
Yeah.
If you're in America,
Yes.
if you're a bad apple, then there's a strong enforcement system.
Yes.
The SEC can go after you. The government will
Yes.
prosecute. And you don't have to do a civil case. You can do criminal charges. So I think in the sense that bad apples can get away with it more in emerging, less mature ecosystems. I think that's number two. But I
Yeah.
think he basically tars it as the whole ecosystem. And I think
Yeah.
that's so frustrating because there's so many good founders that are working their asses off.
Yeah.
Like I think all of their funding just evaporated for the next 2 years because if I was a European VC or American VC, I'll be like, oh my gosh, all the local VCs did their due diligence and they had auditors as well and they didn't catch this. Like
What can
why
I?
yeah, exactly why would a growth stage investor feel like they can trust it? There's a chain of trust where they expect early stage VCs to put up the governance, to put in the financial controls, to have a clear point of view.
Yeah.
And all that failed. Yeah.
I think you touched on a nice point about enforceability, as it sounds like it's a boring conversation, which puts people to sleep. It's not the rule of law, and that's why people choose to invest in certain countries with a higher sort of like perception of the rule of law. The truth is, your point is if you do something badly, CIA, FBI, your law enforcement agents, the lawyers will be breathing down your neck. Gonna get away too easy unless you run away and never ever step back in the US. And even then, they're just gonna breathe down your neck anywhere you go. In places like developing countries or even non-developing countries in some cases, where the rule of law is not so strong, people think that they can get away. And to the point of like, why would he say these things to a very international news agency? Is probably going to be getting away with it as well. Yeah. Yeah.
It's at the ending of the article, he says that right now he is at
Having a
home.
holiday.
Yeah, he's started a frozen business with his shrimp. I was like, wait, he's still. I thought he would be hunkered down. No.
Yeah.
And he's having a normal life right now.
Yeah.
After $1 billion company evaporated from the fraud and hundreds of millions of dollars of investor money getting evaporated.
Yeah. I think it's not a case whereby we say, hey, something went really wrong and probably want to wipe it from the ecosystem. The other part of the article that called out to me was when he said that the systems that they built actually really help local fishermen. And they're different. I've also seen startups who come up with ideas which really don't help anyone else other than their own case. There is a clear use case for what they do. Ecosystem for ideas which actually help people seems like a bit of a pity for me. I think the lessons that we can take for instances like this is to put in the checks and balances and the rules of law. And we have been native when it comes to these things. So if we are working in an ecosystem whereby the traditional modes of enforcement is not going to work, then as an ecosystem, an alternative enforcement that will help boost investor confidence. There'll be various mechanisms to look into it. I'm just being creative over here. I've not seen it in practice, but perhaps an escrow account system that like a bit of a security from the founders to investors. That could be one example. For example, we could have like founders perhaps mortgaging their own personal asset security for the investment coming in. Better financial and accounting standards. There is a accepted financial accounting standard that is common in developing countries, but then having a person who is certified and trusted to come in. Typically, they're called auditors in the Western developed countries, but if we can't call them auditors because these auditors don't actually understand how the local systems work, then we have to come up with a new sort of way to boost investor confidence and get to the same point in a different method. So I do think it's a great pity we don't come up with solutions, but it's going to take a while to get that confidence in.
Yeah. No, I think what's interesting is that I agree with you, social impact, because he's helping these farmers to get from point A to point B. And they talk some beautiful stories in there about how they help a farmer who used to have to do this manually to use automated fish feeders and so forth. I just think that there was an interesting dynamic that they just talk about auditors. And I think the article talks about it, which is that VCs did try to audit. And the way they were doing it was that they brought in PwC to do auditing on the financial side.
Yeah.
And for the VCs, they did visit farmers, right? So 20 separate farmers were visited for the Series B and 70 farmers were visited for the Series C. And so that's actually, if you think about it, it's a lot of work. And I think acknowledge that it's quite difficult because these are rural fish farms. And so these VCs are paying for people to visit all these farms. But what this guy was doing, they said, was they curated a database to be a smaller subset. And then he gave the local managers the facts, i.e., the false numbers, to train the local farmers. And then the local fish farmers gave those rubbish numbers. I think the first thing we talked about was like, hey, he just fudged it a little bit. But now you're like, this is a very systematic effort to deceive. And there is actually effectively like 90 farmers in total that visited and maybe more in earlier rounds. This is a really systematic approach to their fraud. It's like the difference between like Swedish massage, Thai massage, and the intensity of the massage of these numbers is like industrialized at this level.
I have no idea. I would love to hear your perspective, but in my opinion, these advisors simply didn't do their job well. Definitely, whatever he has done is definitely wrong. But can we say that the auditors didn't do any wrong? For me, gross negligence. They have to be held accountable. In my opinion, we would be getting there one day. Put their due diligence was not up to par. If a guy who started off as a fisherman is able to put together sophisticated, I don't even think this is a sophisticated ecosystem, draw parameters to fit your due diligence requirement, then I would say it's the problem of the guys who did the due diligence. And I would actually empathize with the guys who did due diligence before, because I used to sit in this ivory tower when I was working in international law firms, and we were asked to do legal due diligence on very local companies. We're sitting in an ivory castle. We have never run a business before. We don't actually know what we're looking for. The textbook says there's 1 to 10 that you have to tick to 10, or we fix the 3, bought it with assumptions and risk mitigation and stuff like that. But are we actually in a pin to really do due diligence when we have never run a business before? We actually don't know what we're looking for. And actually, if I could be very honest, the things we pick up are very academic. Like, for example, as a lawyer, we'll be looking into things like, is the constitution up to date? Is the register of members, are we seeing the share sets? But does it go into the core of the problem, which is this business actually a real business? Because share sets can be fixed, concepts can be updated. But are we really looking into whether, for example, contracts? So I'll just bring up another example where I was a bit bolder by then, because I was perhaps 7, 8 years into practice. I was a little bit bold because I had the ability to curate my own style. And I actually told the investor not to do the deal. And the thing that I picked up was not legal. The thing that I was only engaged to do legal due diligence, but I looked at the contract and I said, you guys are investing $500,000 into this company. The founders, when you add their compensation together, pays themselves $500,000 each a year. Are you sure your money is going where it's going? And it's simple things like that you don't actually pick up until you start running your own business and you start understanding a little bit more about financial statement, a little bit more. If I had to do it sitting in an ivory tower, I would not have picked up these things. I'll be like, okay, the contract I'm looking at, I'll be looking at the termination provisions. How long is he going to stay for? Does it have good IP clause? Academic things up. Get down and dirty. And maybe then this is an experience thing, because a lot of the fund houses also hired people with zero experience running businesses. Not their fault, because there wasn't an ecosystem in the past. But perhaps now with the lessons that we learned, these guys, founders, can spot and ask the right questions. In my opinion, it was Grant Thornton's fault getting the auditor books. So I have no idea. I think it's a 360 problem.
Yeah. I think it's really not easy at all because, for example, Wirecard also was audited as well for many years successfully as a publicly listed company. That was a tricky part. But I think the physical checks to me show how intense the fraud was. And I don't know if there was an AI software, that would probably be the software for somebody to build. Because like you said, maybe humans just can't do it enough individually. But if I was looking at the most common type of fraud, I think it's round tripping, which is basically you take investor money and then you circulate it back to yourself.
Recycle.
You pay somebody, you recycle that money to buy your own revenue, and then you cycle it multiple times to make that. I feel like that was the same type of fraud that you saw in Wirecard, you saw that eFishery. He said that Jabran said, hey, by setting up a web of subsidiaries and controlling the accounts of farmers on network, the business became so complex that transactions could be paid at will. This became 5 separate companies with over 5,000 accounts being used for transactions such as buying fish feed and selling fish. So I would say that this could be a good AI startup, I would say. I'm just brainstorming here. Just to be like, okay, can we pull up, I don't know, your top suppliers and your top customers? And then can you see if there's come up some kind of relationship between all of them? That's going to be, I think, probably the approach, because it can, like you said, I think the problem is that if the business becomes large enough and transactions large enough that a junior person is accounting a certain of transactions, they can be like, they know like this thing is a bit weird, but they're like, not my problem, it's someone else's problem. And everybody's touching a different part of the elephant. And
Yeah.
then they never pull it together to be like, okay,
Yeah.
it's not good.
I think that's absolutely right. Not by my, but as part of a collective done 100 due diligence reports easily by now. And you're right, we're always touching a little bit of the elephant, and you don't actually even know whether it's an elephant at the end of the day, because it could be a rhinoceros, right? And there's no one person that could put the things together and really understand the big problem issues. The funny thing is, actually, these due diligence reports, I'm sure these auditing reports cost a lot of money. They actually take out a lot of time. And I don't even think that as part of this due diligence process, the world has evolved so much. These due diligence process haven't caught up with the types of new transactions that we're seeing, or the volumes of transactions we're seeing. So definitely, I think a system that's able to consolidate these things in a very rapid manner to paint that overall picture is important. To this particular sort of round-tripping situation you're talking about, there should have been reps and warranties about related party transactions or connected person transactions or companies that you set up or have affiliations with, or even like what we call non-market standard, non-arm's length transactions. Those from a legal perspective, if it was actually disclosed properly. From a financial perspective, I would imagine that would help the audit to spot these issues, to put the blame on a single person or a single institution. Simply put, the truth is the systems for due diligence haven't caught up with the complexity of modern transactions, and that's something we need to look at.
Yeah. I want to turn us to his argument about utilitarian morality and the good that he felt about doing it. And so he mentioned exactly like you said that he felt like he was helping farmers. And so he felt like at the end of the day, he felt quote unquote, the decision that faced was a morality problem. Be honest or inflate the numbers and keep the show on the road for employees and the farmers. It's like a trolley problem and it's never an easy choice. My moral compass is quite mathematical. If the number of impact that I can create at a given time is a potential risk and damage that might be created, then it's still net positive.
Well, what can I say? Anyone who buys that argument needs to go back to school. Earlier in the article, during COVID, or just shortly after COVID, fishery didn't need any more money. So there was
Yeah.
no morality problem there, right? They had enough money to run the business, to help the fishermen. It's just that he got excited that SoftBank was interested, right?
Yeah.
And then after SoftBank got interested, according to his story, and then he even got a call from someone very important. A bunch of other people, Sequoia got interested as well. At that point, was he thinking about morality? And oh yeah, actually, I have enough money to run my business. I can actually help local fishermen. Oh, he was not thinking that. So this guy is very good at, okay, I don't know him, but based on the stories that's put together in this article, he seems to be gaslighting himself, which is something that having done a couple of criminal cases with Swang from time to time, sometimes people convince themselves into believing that they are morally correct. I know of a founder whose name I will not mention, who literally gaslights himself and tells people that he's the most moral person. Being moral and being having lots of integrity is the most important thing. But I've caught blatant lies before. And these are the scariest moral people because they're actually highly immoral and they gaslight themselves into selling a story that they're the people with the most integrity and morality. In this case, I would have imagined if the thinking is correct, and I don't know him personally, so I do not want to say anything that I think is not good. But based on the excerpt of the article, if I had to put a couple of pieces together to who this person is, yeah, of course, I still do not know him, so it's not right for me to jump to this conclusion. Then it seems like he's a guy who has gaslighted himself so much so that he wants to talk about the goodness that he's done and how even though but he was thinking about being like the first
Yeah.
excuse is, hey, everyone did it, therefore I was right in doing it. That he had up all his peers who are in Indonesia, but working really hard. Hey, I help other people, like it's glorious of me to help the fish. But he didn't think about it when he did not need money. He was just excited to actually help backed by the big. And then third, to even do this article actually. Like, what are
That's
you
so
trying to
funny.
get out of this? Like a fan following or what? A cult or yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah, I think the tricky part, right? Because I think he gives utilitarians a bad name. And as somebody who studied economics, I was a big fan of utilitarian philosophy in my undergraduate days. And I was like, this is exactly why all the people who criticize utilitarian philosophy say that if you believe too much in utilitarian philosophy, you end up committing fraud and horrible things. And this is funny because now I'm like 20 years down the road. I'm literally watching this guy quote utilitarianism. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, this guy is
Yes.
proving my professor in the sense that this is just a flawed way of thinking if he truly believes it. And but like you said, it
Yeah.
doesn't hold up anyway because in the context of that, he had multiple times to have come clean. And there were times when he could
Mm-hmm.
have stopped raising more money and been able, like you said, to avoid the consequences already. Raising the first round, sure, you can say you're 3 months away from failure. You have no choice to do it. Then
Yes, correct.
you could
Even
be
then it's
like
still
squid
wrong.
hard. And then you're like,
Yes.
okay, this is going to be the Robin Hood argument from his own
Yeah.
self perspective. So be it. But then,
Yeah.
like you said, there's several rounds of financing afterwards where he had more than enough money for the company. And the company was no
And
longer going to go bankrupt.
this also didn't enjoy how he name dropped. Specifically in this article, he says, oh, he got a text from the Temasek CEO
Mm,
and he was like, wow, It made Dylan look silly in this article by name dropping his name specifically. Didn't talk about the director that did it. He had to name the CEO. Made it look like it was Temasek CEO's fault. From my perspective, right, that everyone play are all human beings, but he was just doing his job. If he hears of a good opportunity, he has to, what's it? The guys will do the work on the ground. They're expected to do due diligence, but you can't be name dropping a guy after you've done so much wrong. That is wrong. It's yeah. It's like saying, hey, I'm actually married, but I did not tell anyone. But then Giselle Bundchen called me, and it was her fault because she called me. It's not right.
To take this money. The
Oh,
soft
poor
framing of that
you.
article. And he
Yeah.
makes it sound like all the people are coming to me and they're pitching
I'm
me
victimized.
and I took the money. That's just the framing of that whole narrative. And I think
Yeah.
the reality is that it was an active effort by him
Yeah.
to falsify the numbers, to manage at least 12 individuals, to manage shell companies, to falsify invoices, to shut down and payments around, and then coach farmers to say the right things when they're approached by
Yeah.
due diligence.
Yeah.
It's not as if he's just sitting back and then money comes and all he did was hit the electronic signature button. He's there managing this group of people. For those who've seen the internal audit reports that have been through the media that was leaked, there were multiple people who were pushing back against, and he was pressuring employees to falsify and Photoshop
Yeah.
invoices when they didn't do it. So this guy was not, the money was, you were doing a lot.
Jeremy, at this point, there's so much fake everywhere that I'm not sure whether maybe this Bloomberg reporter wrote something fake. I'm not sure. Because the other thing that sometimes we hear about is, because I want to give the people some credit as well. I want to understand all the potential blind spots that we're having and try not to point a finger. Maybe he was misquoted. Maybe this story, maybe when he was being, it was into, he said things in a certain way, the reporters pick and choose certain parts that were more juicy and publish it that way. Then perhaps one of the blind spots could be the reporter who did it, reported like clearly, or reported it from a bias standpoint, which is normal because we're all human beings, we're all biased. But yeah, I think if whatever has been reported is objective and as close to what he said as much as possible, then I think this guy owes an apology.
Have you said sorry?
In fact, I'm going to control F. Oh, I control F, sorry. There was the results.
Check for apologize.
Okay, hit
What is
it.
it?
I just want to say my deepest apology for everyone impacted, especially the farmers, because that's the reason why I do this. No, I
Okay.
think he needs a bit more than that. You know,
I want to hear what you say.
no, I was just reading the line above. He says he wants to state publicly he didn't steal money and he wants to make it clear that his employees weren't aware of what's happening. I think in his head, he didn't steal money because he, in his mind, and I'm not even sure that that's true, he didn't pocket the money to buy himself a Ferrari. Perspective, he feels like it's morally just. But I think stealing is more than that. Yeah.
So I think the internal consulting audit by FTI suggested that some employees siphoned money, and Jabran did draw a salary and bonus commensurate with a much larger company. He did seem to live a fairly modest life. So, quote unquote, he says that none of his detractors has produced evidence he embezzled money. But I think, which is, this guy was owning equity. So you could say that he didn't transfer cash out of the system. And obviously, if there is a criminal or civil case comes out, maybe the evidence will find out whether it is true or not true. But even he is benefiting from an equity perspective, is holding all this equity. So there is a financial gain that he thought he was having by becoming $1 billion company. Effectively, assuming that he owned a quarter of the company at $1 billion, his equity was at least $100 million worth. So I just find it a little bit like, what's the word?
Doesn't make sense.
It makes sense. I mean, at first you're like, oh, at least he didn't embezzle money. And you're like, but he's holding equity. So the paper value of that money was going up.
Yeah, because he stole money from the LPs. And Temasek is a fund that was created originally by our forefathers, right? The income tax they're paying, whatever the investments that we made. So he stole money from funds.
Yeah, it to his employees, his farmers, and it was in a paper valuation gain. So he basically saying, I didn't steal cash from the company because I wasn't allowed to cash out yet.
Exactly.
That's what I'm just saying. So you're like, then the government caught the criminal before the money was transferred out. Oh, like I never pulled it out of the ATM, so the criminal never benefited from the scam, right? What? No, it's your entity, it's your control. The subsidiaries that are holding this round tripping cash is under your control. The employees you are paying off with bonuses to manipulate these invoices and manipulate these payments are under your control. So I just find it, and I thought it was a good point that you raised. I'm just saying, dude, like,
How much of a blind spot that is.
it's a
Something
good
that
one because I
yeah.
honestly didn't catch that on the first reading. Because even when I first read it the first time around, I also was like,
Yeah.
oh, he didn't only driving a Hyundai Ioniq 5. Wow.
It's not how stealing cash works.
Yeah, exactly.
Just sort of like to wrap up the conversation a little bit. One of the things we talked about before is whether or not this slowdown is systemic or cyclical. Systemic being there's just no room for investments in startups in a region like this possible to trust. Or is it cyclical, whereby we're going to learn that we are existing in this cycle in terms of the integrity of the numbers and solutions to not get around it, but understand those numbers a bit better. Understanding from both sides, because in the last cycle that both of us lived through, some of the young VC employees were absolute dicks, would go up to founders, being all braggy and disgusting. And it creates an ecosystem whereby also the founders feel like they have to either live up to a certain standard or be pushed to a certain position. So whether or not we learn from these mistakes, and also on the founder side, we also had absolute dicks who, because they came from like a good pedigree, became really arrogant about. So I hope that this cycle, these mistakes, results in a healthier ecosystem in the next cycle rather than it being systemic.
My perspective, and I'd love to hear your reaction to it, is that the difference between structural or cyclical is whether there are consequences for
Oh.
this founder.
Oh.
So my perspective is that if there is no enforcement action against a public confession, clear facts, clear paper trail, in his own words, he explains how he did it and why he did it. And if nobody investigates him in either Indonesia, because that's where the company was domiciled, or Singapore, where his co-owned company was and where there are significant investors, then I think Southeast Asia ecosystem, the regulators will suddenly find, oh wait, there is now a systematic lack of trust because bad apples walk away scot-free. And
That's
so I think my perspective is, I think there's an opportunity now. If, look, like you have prosecution, right? And then you have defense, and then you have a judge. So let the judge figure out what's true, right? Because I still can say like maybe there's some other evidence that's come up. But with this clarity that he said it himself, and obviously he not only has these notes, he probably has, the Bloomberg has probably written notes of what exactly he said, etc. Like, to me, it's probably to the prosecution looks like a slam dunk case because you just PDF the article and you just put it into your discovery thing. And then if you're the defense, you're like, I don't know, thinking to yourself like, oh my gosh, why? Like, how do you defend this guy when this guy just said how he did it and why he did it? So anyway, I'm just saying like you have sovereign wealth funds from around the world, from Europe, from Singapore. You have local Indonesian investors. You have Middle Eastern. You have SoftBank. I'm just saying everybody's there. Everybody has money. If there are no consequences, then I think everyone's just gonna be like, what do you think about that?
I 100% agree with you, actually. These are things we're going to learn in the next cycle to fix it in this cycle. And to your point, I think it's not just about the founder, it's about holding the auditors accountable, holding the guys who did do accountable. Accountability doesn't mean stripping them of their ability to, but there has to be some sort of a pain, whether it's a financial pain or a temporary suspension, or at least an investigation for accountability on how do you guys actually sign off on these numbers. Some chicken did a report that was highly scoped. Made it clear that, okay, we're only referring to these fishermen that we're talking about. Then at least we know in the next cycle that we can't rely on the scoping by the founders. We have to randomly pick them ourselves. So I think that's a really important point, and I hope that we pick this up live.
And I think that if I may add one point, is that I empathize with why individual private parties do not feel the incentive to conduct a civil investigation, right? Because if you're a VC
More
and you already
money.
lost 85 cents on a dollar, are you really going to spend?
Were so
Yeah,
expensive.
just spending on
Yes.
who are so expensive, like Rachel and all these other people, may not have much assets because he only has a Hyundai Ioniq 5. You know, I was just saying the ROI of litigation,
Yes.
extract more from it. So
Yeah.
I just want to identify that I think that's probably the calculus from the individual parties. And also there's a lot of different parties, right? So everybody else will look at each other and say, why don't you do it? Why don't you pay for it? Because nobody wants to like coordination
Yes.
problem, right? And there's no class action lawsuit mechanism as easy as America to roll up. You can imagine the fish farmers as a group doing a class action lawsuit if they're in America saying that they lost obviously productivity and money from working eFishery. So I think basically this is coordination problem. And I wouldn't be shocked if something doesn't really happen unless there's maybe some smaller people who are just rich enough and they say they're going to do the right thing and write it from their own checkbook. The other part is that criminal piece, right? Would Singapore, I hate to say this, call Singapore government police, right? The sovereign wealth was defrauded, which is taxpayer money. Or you can look at Indonesia, there's also a lot of capital, the local police force. Again, I'm not saying that we know what the outcome of this investigation is, but I think there has to be some kind of investigation to figure out the truth of this matter. There's a big confession that's been made. Let the evidence shake out. But I think that expectation is if a regulator, I'm just saying hypothetically, a Singapore regulator says, this is a Singapore holding company, it is fraud, we're willing to investigate this, we let the thing churn, justice and the system. And then after several years, we figure out what the situation is, right? The truth of the matter, which also includes this Bloomberg article in both the prosecution and the defense evidence. Let the court make a decision, and then Indonesia can choose whether to extradite him to Singapore. But at least at the end of that process, if you were a Singapore VC, you would be like, okay, if I invest in a company that's a Singapore holding company, and if Singapore is supposed to be the Delaware of Asia, not just Southeast Asia, but India, China, if it's supposed to be this Delaware court, then justice of protecting all minority shareholders has to be part of the Delaware thing. Because if not, then what's the point? Then you might as well not have a Singapore holding company, because the only reason why you have a Singapore holding company is just because it's easier to wire money in US dollars. You know what I mean?
It's a really good standpoint. I've been struggling and asking myself why I continue being a lawyer every single day. And I think I found the answer. What we study in the textbooks actually makes sense.
Yeah, like I said, I'm not asking for an investigation. That's all I'm just saying. But I'm also pointing the other side, which is, man, like supposedly a Singapore holding company is because they have Singapore courts and Singapore rule of law.
Yeah.
And so far it's crickets, right? So yeah.
Awesome.
Oh, fingers crossed. I hope that is cyclical. It is not structural. And then that's what we hope for.
And investigations will commence properly.
Justice be, and if he is innocent, let it be innocent. If he's guilty, let him be guilty. And then let it sort out from there, right? But at least then the system knows that it's not going to be swept under the rug. These are the paramedics. Okay, on that note, peace out. See you, Rachel.
See you.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.